Hey everyone, James here. Today going to be bringing you another Italian genre film review, Manhunt in the City, 1975. So this is a Poliziotteschi, not to be confused with Manhunt, aka Italian Connection, the great Fernando De Leo film. Film I consider to be kind of one of the sort of seminal texts of the Poliziotteschi and one of the very best examples. So this one exists in the somewhat maligned subgenre of the Italian vigilante films, along with such films like Street Law or The Big Racket. You could even put that one in there. There's a whole bunch of them, all kind of coming out around this time. I think Street Law was probably the film that really kicked it off. And, you know, it's easy to see these films as kind of Death Wish inspired, and there is certainly a little bit of that Death Wish DNA in them, but in many ways these films were being developed adjacent to them, and so it's not exactly a kind of a one-to-one, with Death Wish. I think Death Wish in some ways is a little bit of a simpler film. I do like those Charles Bronson films too, and the sequels for Death Wish came out much, much later after kind of the Poliziotteschi genre had really slimmed down and wasn't producing all that many films. So the basic synopsis is a man attempts to track down the people that killed his daughter in a jewelry robbery. And what should be mentioned, of course, is and Italian genre fans, especially those of the Poliziotteschi, will know this man is played by none other than Henry Silva. And so why would you watch this film? Well, it's a rare good guy role for him, and it has just enough of kind of the genre thrills to just kind of keep you going. For my own opinion of this film is that it's a little bit subpar Umberto Lenzi. I think it's perfectly watchable, and if you like these sorts of films, you're going to like it. I do mostly like this film. Nevertheless, I find it a little bit lower than average. I'd say probably only for a kind of Lenzi completist. So it's written by Dardano Sacchetti, who is a very, very significant name in kind of Italian genre film. This is fairly early on in his career, and he worked kind of in Gialli and Poliziotteschi during this time, would continue to work long after even the industry had gone very, very downhill. So kind of says something about the man's kind of cachet in the industry. A lot of people really winded down and stopped working once kind of the Italian genre film kind of ceased to exist as they were in kind of the 70s and the early 80s, or they moved to television or something like that. But Sacchetti kept on working. And, you know, he writes kind of juicy dialogue. I believe he penned New York Ripper. And so I think he kind of suits Lenzi in some sense, kind of emphasizing sort of the sleazier sides of things. And for me, at least, Lenzi kind of represents that. Is just kind of willing to do whatever is necessary, a lot of misanthropy, just someone that has a lot of like potential nihilism, but also a lot of cynicism in most of his films. Not necessarily always in the most coherent ways, like someone like Damiano Damiani, but it's something that you'll definitely see in a lot of his Poliziotteschi's, which is like kind of one of the main sort of moods of those films too. This one in particular is probably one of his least seen Poliziotteschi's. I think I looked at Letterboxd, and it's this and basically From Corleone with Brooklyn, a film I think is fairly underrated, that are the least seen by amount of Letterboxd users. Part of that, I think, is because the Tomas Milian Lenzi box set from Severin came out and released a lot of the other different films that people hadn't seen a whole lot of. Personally, for me, I think this is kind of lower end as well, so I wouldn't recommend this necessarily first for people to watch. Okay, so let's see, a few points here. Yeah, so this film came out a year after Street Law, which really kind of kicked out that Italian vigilante films. You can also see a little bit of Straw Dogs here. It kind of has this situation, including kind of the lighting and the very, very brown look of everything that sort of references Peckinpah's Straw Dogs. Not the first person to make this comparison. I think even Roberto Curti did at the time. One interesting thing about this Poliziotteschi that I did not pick up on the first time, because I had really gotten into this genre pre-getting into Giallos, is a lot of the way that they cut to Henry Silva with his daughter is very much like a Gialli. It's helped by the fact that this is scored by Bruno Nicolai, who scored a lot of Gialli, but it's a particularly loungy kind of soundtrack, or at least some of the themes that play are for a Poliziotteschi, which tend to have a little bit of a different vibe than those Gialli soundtracks. But the way it kind of cuts to the past and things like that reminds me a lot of different Giallis. So if Syndicate Sadist is sort of the more Western, spaghetti Western inspired Umberto Lenzi Poliziotteschi, this one is a little bit more of kind of jolly in a way. It's definitely less jolly than Syndicate Sadist's Western, but there are moments in the film that felt very much kind of straight out of a jolly that would have come out 2 or 3 years before. And why is this film not quite as good? I think in some ways, even though I love him, I think it's probably just because Henry Silva is a little bit overused. I think some guys ideally use him in like 15 to 20% of the film. Someone like Henry Silva has like just a great look. He's a great supporting part. He just has such a strong presence and things like that. Nevertheless, I think something like Franco Nero in Street Law or Fabio Testi in The Big Racket, they're just stronger leading men. I think the other reason why this film isn't quite as good as Street Law or Big Racket 2 is Lenzi is just not quite as good as action as Castellari. Both films don't necessarily have the most super clear messages. In fact, I think in many ways, while you could certainly make the case that this film has kind of fascist messaging or anti-police messaging, perhaps even too, it kind of just picks apart at all the different sides of things. It portrays the police as pretty as not great, and kind of the bureaucracy that they're bogged down as kind of a major hindrance. But the kind of extrajudicial organizations that we're introduced to here too are not portrayed as super great either. One of them is kind of ran by this lawyer that we find out later is a child molester as well. So in that sense, it's kind of fitting with the sort of Lenzi filmography of just kind of taking down everyone in between. In fact, we see some scenes that I think are some of the more effective scenes where Henry Silva basically goes along with those sort of extrajudicial organizations, and you see them kind of don the masks and beat people up, and it's clear that it's not necessarily glorifying these two. So I don't know, in some ways the social messaging does work, but I think it's sort of one of those things where if you think about it too hard, you can sort of pick apart it at the seams. Other performance here, it's mostly Italian cast other than Silva. Maybe another reason why the film isn't wholly successful too. I kind of like it when Henry Silva is like your number 2 in the film and you have someone like, Mario Adorf in Italian Connection comes to mind. I like the sort of mix and mash you have between those and like the Woody Strode character. You have Luciana Paluzzi here too, speaking of Italian Connection. It doesn't have a whole lot to do here. Nonetheless, it's nice always to see her face as sort of like a familiar Italian actress and great performer at the time too. There's a couple sets here that I noted too. The boat from Almost Human is undoubtedly the same one. It looks very, very much the same. Another thing that I thought was interesting too, coming back to this, partly I didn't pick up on this when I had seen this film 4 or 5 years ago. It uses a similar kind of country club greenish set, almost like a golf club set, as Execution Squad, where they're showing the extrajudicial group, which is also where they showed kind of like that death squad in Execution Squad 2. So for me at least, that imaging sort of burned in my mind about that. Other than that, I don't know that this film really stands out too much. I like the soundtrack, but the look of the film is a little bit bland as far as these go. The action is good, but it's not necessarily the best. So I think some of it is just like there's not that much that stands out in a way that Street Law has a couple images and the use of slow motion that really is kind of seared into the brain. So for me at least, this film suffers a lot in comparison to, in my opinion, the superior Italian vigilante films. A thing that this film does succeed in, though, is that you do feel like Silva has a decent chance to actually lose. And he's not necessarily, there's a certain vulnerability and things that are granted to his character that you're not always going to see, especially with that kind of stone-cold look and things. He is in far more danger than you would think. There's a fairly harrowing scene where him and Luciana Paluzzi are kind of hunted down. People are breaking the windows and things like that, and it's filmed very well. So there are certain scenes that certainly do stand out as being quite well executed and things like that, and that sense of danger I'd say it is fairly successful at. The ironic ending I think is pretty good overall. I kind of like that twist that they did apply to the end, so again, spoilers here. But again, I think if you're looking for really, really clear social messaging, I don't know that it's super clear or necessarily the best that the genre has to offer. Okay, so who won the film? Gonna give it to Lenzi. I think Silva, as much as I love him, is not necessarily a great actor, and so I don't think he can quite carry the film as much as probably people would like, so I'm gonna give it to Lenzi as a result. I like the way that the final shootout is staged. There is a little bit of nice car action and things like that too. Yeah, overall, very much kind of a film product of its time, and worth checking out if you are fans of these films. I do enjoy this film overall, even if I have a couple complaints about it. I just say it's a little bit on the weaker end of the Lenzi Poliziotteschi. I was wondering why I didn't remember this film quite as well, which is one reason I chose to revisit it. I think part of that, has become firmer in my mind there. There are certain Lenzi films that are really unforgettable. I think Almost Human would be one. Violent Naples is another one for me as well. And this film, I think, is kind of just a little bit on the blander side of things, too. Like the Italian settings and things like that are not used as much as I would love to see them used. Okay, so not bad by any stretch, but I think there are better Lenzi Poliziotteschi to watch. So very curious to hear others' opinions of this film. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see some more Italian genre film reviews, and I will see you all next time. Cheers.